Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on the time of the day you're watching this video lecture. And this is Attorney Osedula II, and this video lecture is part of my RFBT series. So in this video, I will cover or I will tackle the Batas Pambansa Bilang 22, more commonly known as the Anti-Bouncing Check Law, and how to get away with BP 22 cases. Okay, despite the effectivity of Batas Pambansa Bilang 22, or more commonly known as the Anti-Bouncing Check Law, for 4 decades, thousands and thousands of worthless rubber checks still flow into our banking system, which eventually find their way in the clogged dockets of our judicial system. According to the National Prosecution Service of the Department of Justice, BP 22 cases rank second in their list of most number of cases that the prosecution agency filed in court in 2017. So this is next to illegal drug cases. So most criminal cases in our courts are number one with illegal drug cases, and just ranked in number two, the BP 22 cases, anti-bouncing checks law. So why is it important for you to study this bouncing checks law? It is important because it is part of the RFBT syllabus, or regulatory framework for business transactions. It is actually on 2.0. So there are actually eight major topics under RFBT, and this is one of them. So bouncing checks law. So under this topic, we shall discuss and apply the requisites to be liable under BP 22. We will also discuss the elements of BP 22, checks without sufficient funds, evidence of knowledge of insufficient funds, the duty of drawee. In the syllabus, it's duty of the drawer, but there is no duty of the drawer under BP 22. And we will also find the meaning of the term credit under BP 22. And last, compare bouncing checks with estafa under Article 315, Paragraph 2, Letter D of the Revised Penal Code. So in the LECPA, or licensure exam for CPA, there will be two questions dealing with this topic. Okay. So before we begin our discussion on BP 22, let's define what a check is. By definition, a check is a bill of exchange drawn on a bank payable on demand. It is a written order on a bank purporting to be drawn against a deposit of funds for the payment of all events of a sum of money to a certain person therein named, or to his order, or to cash and payable on demand. Unlike a promissory note, a check is not a mere undertaking to pay an amount of money. It is an order addressed to a bank and partakes of a representation that the drawer has funds on deposit against which the check is drawn, sufficient to ensure payment upon its presentation to the bank. There is therefore an element of certainty or assurance that the instrument will be paid upon presentation, and for this reason, checks have become widely accepted as a medium of payment in trade and commerce. Although not a legal tender, checks have come to be perceived as convenient substitutes for currency in commercial and financial transactions. The basis or foundation of such perception is confidence. If such confidence is shaken, the usefulness of checks as currency substitutes would be greatly diminished or may become zero. So any practice, therefore, tending to destroy that confidence should be deterred, for the proliferation of worthless checks can only create havoc in the trade circles and banking community. On the second bullet, a check is a negotiable instrument that serves as a substitute for money and as a convenient form of payment in financial transactions and obligation. So the use of checks as payment allows commercial and banking transactions to proceed without the actual handling of money, thus doing away with the need to physically count bills and coins whenever payment is made. In this slide, this is a sample of a check. So let's identify the parts of a check. So here, the account name. So this is the drawer. So paid to the order of Jose Dula II. So this is the payee. And the drawee is Banco de Oro FTI Complex Branch. Okay, so there's the date and the amount in figures and the amount in words. So next is the types of check. So what are the different types of check? So first we have this accommodation check. It is a check drawn for the purpose of lending a person's name to another. On the other hand, we have a guarantee check, which it may either be an accommodation or any other kind of check drawn and delivered to guarantee the performance of a principal obligation. On the last type of check, we have a cross check. A cross check has the following effects. Number one, that the check may not be in cash but only deposited in the bank. Second is that the check may be negotiated only once to one who has an account with a bank. And third effect is that the act of crossing the check serves as a warning to the holder that the check has been issued for a definite purpose, so that he must inquire if he has secured the check pursuant to that purpose. So does BP22 cover accommodation or guarantee check? So the answer is yes, it is covered by BP22 because the issuance of the check to cover the account and its subsequent dishonor are the only facts required for the prosecution under the law. In the case of People versus Ke, it was held that BP22 does not make any distinction as to whether the bad check is issued in payment of an obligation or to guarantee an obligation. So therefore, BP22 covers accommodation or guarantee check. So in this slide, discuss and apply the requisites to be liable under BP22. So in cases for violation of BP22, the following essential elements must be established. Number one, the making, drawing, and issuance of any check to apply for account or for value. Number two, the knowledge of the maker, drawer, or issuer that at the time of issue there were no sufficient funds in or credit with the drawee bank for the payment of such check in full upon its presentment. Third element, the dishonor of the check by the drawee bank for insufficiency of funds or credit, or the dishonor for the same reason had not the drawer without any valid cause ordered the drawee bank to stop payment. Again, BP22 is aimed at putting a stop to or curbing the practice of issuing checks that are worthless. That is, the checks that end up being rejected or dishonored for payment. The practice is prescribed by the state because of the injury it causes to the public interest. The enactment of BP22 is a declaration by the legislature that as a matter of public policy, the making and issuance of a worthless check is deemed public nuisance to be abated by the imposition of penal sanctions in the form of payment and possibly imprisonment. And the gravamen of the offense punished by BP22 is the act of making and issuing a worthless check or a check that is dishonored upon its presentation for payment. It is not the non-payment of an obligations which the law punishes. And the law is not intended or designed to coerce a debtor to pay his debt. The thrust of the law is to prohibit, under the pain of penal sanctions, the making of worthless checks and putting them in circulation. Because of its deleterious effects on the public interest, the practice is prescribed by the law. The law punishes the act not as an offense against property, but an offense against public order. This slide, this is the act punished by BP 22. So any person who makes or draws and issues any check to apply on account or for value, knowing at the time of issue that he does not have sufficient funds in or credit with the drawee bank for the payment of such check in full upon its presentment, which check is subsequently dishonored by the drawee bank for insufficiency of funds or credit, or would have been dishonored for the same reason had not the drawer, without any valid reason, ordered the bank to stop payment, shall be punished by imprisonment of not less than 30 days but not more than 1 year. So that is the penal imprisonment sanction for BP 22, or by a fine of not less than but not more than double the amount of the check, which fine shall in no case exceed 200,000 pesos. Another act punished by BP 22. The same penalty shall be imposed upon any person who, having sufficient funds in or credit with the drawee bank, when he makes or draws and issues a check, shall fail to keep sufficient funds or maintain a credit to cover the full amount of the check if presented within a period of 90 days from the date appearing thereon. So in this slide, we distinguish daif versus daud. So if you're not aware, daif means drawn against insufficient funds. On the other hand, we have daud or drawn against uncleared deposit. So if a check bounced and it was declared drawn against insufficient fund, the drawer may be held liable for BP 22. On the other hand, if the drawer issues a check and it was declared by the bank as DAUD or DAUD, drawn against uncleared deposit, the drawer is not liable for BP 22. In the case of Tan versus People, the court acquitted the drawer of the check who was indicted under BP 22 upon a check which was dishonored for the reason DAUD or drawn against uncleared deposit. So even without relying on the credit line, the drawer's bank account covered the check she issued, because even though there were some deposits that were still uncollected, the deposits became good and the bank certified that the check was funded. The evidence of knowledge of insufficient funds. So the making, drawing, and issuance of a check payment of which is refused by the drawee because of insufficient funds in or credit with such bank, when presented within 90 days from the date of check, it shall be a prima facie evidence of knowledge of such insufficiency of funds, unless such maker or drawer pays the holder thereof, or make arrangements for payments in full by the drawee of such check within 5 banking days after receiving notice that such check has not been paid by the drawee. So there is a presumption in this provision of law. The presumption is brought into existence only after it is proved that the issuer had received a notice of dishonor, and that within 5 days from receipt of such notice of dishonor, he failed to pay the amount of the check, or he failed to make arrangements for its payment. The presumption or prima facie evidence as provided in this section cannot arise if such notice of non-payment or notice of dishonor by the drawee bank is not sent to the maker or drawer of the check, or there is no proof as to when such notice was received by the drawer, since there would simply be no way of reckoning the crucial 5-day period. So it is not enough for the prosecution to prove that a notice of dishonor was sent to the drawee of the check. The prosecution must also prove the actual receipt of such notice, because the fact of service provided for in the law is reckoned from receipt of such notice of dishonor by the drawee of the check. Here, duty of drawer in the syllabus for October 2022 examination for RFBT. It was written for 2.1.3, the duty of drawer, wherein it must be corrected. It must be the duty of drawee. Okay, so the rules on evidence for the duty of the drawee: it shall be the duty of the drawee or the bank of any check, when refusing to pay the same to the holder thereof upon presentment, to cause to be written, printed, or stamped in plain language thereon the reason for drawee's dishonor or refusal to pay the same. If the bank doesn't pay the check, they must indicate in the check, or cause to be written, printed, or stamped in plain language. For example, drawn against insufficient fund, or yung DAIF. Or pwede rin naman DAUD, or drawn against uncleared deposit. So pwede rin yung reason ng bank for not paying the check is closed account. Yan. So in all prosecutions under this law, the introduction in evidence of any unpaid and dishonored check having the drawee's refusal to pay stamped or written thereon or attached thereto, with the reason therefore as aforesaid, shall be prima facie evidence of the making or issuance of said check and the due presentment to the drawee for payment and the dishonor thereof, and that the same was properly dishonored for the reason written, stamped, or attached by the drawee on such dishonored check. So continuing the duty of the drawee, so notwithstanding the receipt of an order to stop payment, the drawee shall state in the notice that there were no sufficient funds in or credit with such bank for the payment in full of such check, if such be the fact. So even if the bank received an order or received a call from the issuer of the check that the payment be stopped, okay, so there is still a duty on the part of the bank to indicate whether there is sufficient funds or not, because under the law, under BP 22, even if the drawers ordered its bank to stop its payment, the same shall be prosecuted under BP 22. So there is a duty on the part of the bank to indicate whether there is a sufficient fund to cover the amount of check. So kahit na meron tayong stop payment order from the drawer, kailangan indicate pa rin ni bank if merong sufficient funds to cover the amount of check. Term or the word credit as used in BP 22. So the word credit as used herein shall be construed to mean an arrangement or understanding with the bank for the payment of such check. Okay, so for example, the drawer issued a check amounting to 50,000 pesos, and he has knowledge that at the time of the issuance of such check, that his bank account has only 40,000 pesos. So the same, may he be prosecuted for BP 22, because if you check the facts, diba? He issued a check amounting to 50,000, pero meron lang siyang 40,000 sa bank. Okay? So kung titingnan mo, kung magko-conclude ka na based on those facts, madadaif yung check or madadrawn against insufficient fund. But what if si drawer has an arrangement or understanding with the bank for credit? Okay? So, pwede kasing si drawer, meron siyang allowance for overdraft. Let's say, meron siyang allowance amounting to 20,000 pesos. So, in our example, he issued a check amounting to 50,000. Meron siyang 40,000 na bank na laman sa bangko, and meron siyang overdraft amounting to 20,000 pesos. So in that particular case, the bank or the drawee may still honor the check amounting to 50,000 pesos even if he has only 40,000 pesos in his bank account. It is because there is an arrangement or understanding with the bank for the payment of such check. So meron siyang meron siyang credit. Okay? Now, this is the last part of the syllabus for bouncing checks law. So we have to compare bouncing checks with estafa under Article 315, Paragraph 2, Letter D of the Revised Penal Code. So what are the elements of estafa under Paragraph 2D, Article 15 of the RPC? So number one element, the post-dating or issuance of a check in payment of an obligation contracted at the time the check was issued. So, parang kaliwaan system lang dito nangyari sa first element. So, nagpautang and yung isa naman nag-issue ng check for the payment of such debt. Okay? So, element number 2, lack of sufficiency of funds to cover the check. Okay, so pwedeng walang funds or kulang yung funds to cover the amount of check issued. And yung last element natin is yung damage to the pay. So these are the elements of estafa under Article 315 Paragraph 2T of the Revised Penal Code. So compare bouncing checks with estafa. So in the case of Nieras versus Judge Dukuy, the court laid down the fundamental differences between BP22 and estafa. So they are the following. So in estafa, it is important that there is deceit and damage, and these are not required under. There is no such requirement under BP22. So in BP22, mere issuance of a check that is dishonored gives rise to the presumption of knowledge on the part of the drawer that he issued the same without sufficient funds, and hence punishable, which is not so under the penal code, under the RPC. So what are the other differences? What are the other differences between the two? So a drawer of a dishonored check may be convicted under BP22 if he had issued the same for a pre-existing obligation. So in issuing a check for payment of in issuing a check as payment for a pre-existing debt, the drawer does not derive any material benefit in return or as consideration for its issuance. On the part of the payee, he had already parted with his money or property before the check is issued to him. Hence, he is not defrauded by means of any prior or simultaneous deceit perpetrated on him by the drawer of the check. While under Article 315 2D of the Revised Penal Code, such circumstance negates criminal liability. So the scope of paragraph 2D, however, was deemed to exclude checks issued in payment of pre-existing obligations. Okay? So if merong pre-existing obligation, he cannot be prosecuted under Article 315, paragraph 2D of the revised penal code. So the rationale of this interpretation is that in estafa, the deceit using the defraudation must be prior to or simultaneous with the commission of fraud. So another distinction is that specific and different penalties are imposed in each of the two offenses. Other difference, violation of BP 22 is principally a crime against public interest, whereas in estafa it is essentially a crime against property. Violation of BP 22 is principally a crime against public interest as it does injury to the entire banking system. So last, violations of BP 22 are mala prohibita, whereas violations of Article 315 of the Revised Penal Code are mala inse. Mala inse meaning it is evil in itself, whereas mala prohibita, it is prohibited because there is such law prohibiting the acts. Conviction for both crime and offense. So according to Section 5 of BP 22, prosecution under this act shall be without prejudice to any liability for violation of any provision of the revised penal code. So ibig sabihin lang nito, an accused may be prosecuted for BP 22 and Article 315 o yung estafa under Article 315 paragraph 2D at the same time. Okay, so essentially, while a BP 22 case and an estafa case may be rooted from an identical set of facts, they nevertheless present different causes of action, which under the law are considered separate, distinct, and independent from each other. So therefore, both cases can proceed to their final adjudication both as to their criminal and civil aspects, subject to the prohibition on double recovery. So to illustrate, let me share with you the case of People versus Julie Grace Villanueva. So in August 1994, Loreto Madarang met Villanueva through a townmate. So the latter was interested in buying jewelry, si Villanueva, yung accused in this case. So si Loreto Madarang naman is in the business of selling jewelries. So Madarang went to Villanueva's residence at the Galeria de Magallanes and was able to sell to Villanueva 5 sets of jewelry worth 1,010,000 pesos. So Villanueva made out 9 checks drawn against Philippine National Bank, 8 of which were post-dated. So upon delivery of the jewelries, nag-abot ng check agad si Villanueva, yung accused dito sa case na to. So Madarang received the checks because of Villanueva's assurance that they would all be honored upon presentment. However, the drawee bank paid only 2 checks out of the 9 checks issued by Villanueva. So the remaining 7 checks being dishonored either by reason of account closed or drawn against insufficient funds. So Madarang tried to call and see Villanueva at her residence to inform her of the dishonored checks. But Madarang was barred by security guards from reaching Villanueva. Madarang resorted to sending demand letters, but her effort to contact Villanueva proved futile. So after Villanueva did not settle her obligation, so Madarang brought the criminal complaint for estafa, and the corresponding information for estafa was ultimately filed in court. So in this case, the issue is whether or not the accused may be prosecuted for both BP 22 and estafa under Article 315, paragraph 2D of the revised penal code. So the estafa charge in the information may be committed therefore when the offender has post-dated or issued a check in payment of an obligation contracted at the time of the post-dating or issuance, or at the time of post-dating or issuance of said check, the offender has no funds in the bank or the funds deposited are not sufficient to cover the amount of the check, and the payee has been defrauded. So in this case, Villanueva was found to be guilty of estafa under Article 315, paragraph 2D. So the deceit should be the efficient cause of the defraudation and should either be prior to or simultaneous with the act of fraud. So accordingly, all the elements of estafa were present in this case. So the first element was admitted by Villanueva, who confirmed that she had issued the checks to Madarang in exchange for the jewelry she had purchased. There is no question that Madarang accepted the checks upon the assurance of Villanueva that they would be funded upon presentment. So it is clear that Madarang would not have parted with and entrusted the pieces of valuable jewelry to Villanueva, whom she barely knew unless Villanueva gave such assurance to her. So the second element was likewise established because the checks were dishonored upon presentment due to insufficiency of funds or because the account was already closed. The third element was also proved by showing that Madarang suffered prejudice by her failure to collect from Villanueva the balance of 995,000 pesos. So in this case, the accused Julie Grace Villanueva uh, was convicted of BP 22 and estafa under Article 315, paragraph 2D. So here, in this problem, it is part of 2018 bar examinations, the year I took my bar exam. So this problem is part of the bar examinations in criminal law, but it is applicable in our lecture for today. So the question is, can he be held liable under both actions? Letter B, if the check is presented for payment after 4 months but before it became stale, can the two actions still proceed? So yan yung question natin. So the problem is, Rashid asked Rene to lend him 50,000 pesos payable in 6 months, and as payment for the loan, Rashid issued a post-dated check for the said amount, plus the agreed interest. Rashid assured Rene that the account would have sufficient funds on maturity date. On that date, Rene presented the check to the drawee bank for the payment, but it was dishonored for the reason that it was daif. Rene sent Rashid a timely notice of dishonor of the check and demanded the latter to make good the same within 5 days from notice. After the lapse of the 5-day notice, Rene redeposited the check with the drawee bank, but again it was dishonored for the same reason. So Rene filed two cases. Number one, estafa under Article 315, and number two, violation of BP 22. Now question again, can he be held liable under both actions? So we have just discussed the case of People versus Julie Grace Villanueva, and in that case, she was convicted for both offenses under Article 315 and BP 22. So to answer letter A, yes, Rashid can be held liable for BP 22 and estafa. So essentially, while a BP 22 and an estafa case may be rooted from an identical set of facts, they nevertheless present different causes of action, which under the law are considered separate, distinct, and independent from each other. Both cases therefore can proceed to their final adjudication, but both as to their criminal and civil aspects. So for letter B, If the check is presented for payment after 4 months, which is beyond the 90-day period, but before it became stale, can the two actions still proceed? Can the two actions still proceed? So the answer is yes, the two actions can still proceed. The presentation of the check beyond the 90-day period would be of no consequence. So in this case kasi it was presented after 4 months. So inconsequential yung pagpe-present niya even beyond the 90-day period. The 90-day period is not an element of the offense. So remember yung elements natin for BP 22. So the 90-day period is not an element of the offense but merely a condition for the prima facie presumption of knowledge of the insufficiency of funds. That the check must be deposited within 90 days is simply one of the conditions for the prima facie presumption of knowledge of lack of funds to arise. So it does not discharge the drawer, or in this case Rashid, from his duty to maintain sufficient funds in his account. So in this slide, I will discuss on how to get away with BP 22 cases. So I have already discussed to you the elements of BP 22. So as long as you avoid one of those elements, the case for BP 22 will be dismissed. Okay, so how to get away with BP 22 cases? The element of knowledge of insufficiency of funds or credit is not present, and therefore the crime does not exist. So when the drawer either, number 1, pays the holder of the check the amount due thereon within 5 banking days after receiving the notice of dishonor. So kung ikaw yung issuer ng check and the same was dishonored by the bank for a reason, let's say daif or account closed, you should pay the holder of the check. You should pay the payee written in the check. So if such is the case, hindi na magpo-prosper yung BP 22 case. So assuming naman hindi mo kayang bayaran within 5 days tumalbog yung check and hindi mo siya kayang bayaran within 5 days, you should make arrangement with the holder of the check for payment in full of such amount. Okay, and you should make this arrangement within a period of 5 banking days after the receipt of the notice of dishonor or notice of non-payment. So here is one of the possible defenses in a BP 22 case. So if the drawer of the bump check did not receive the notice of dishonor or notice of non-payment, so it is a defense under BP 22. Okay, so if notice of non-payment by the drawee bank is not sent to the maker or drawer of the bump check, or if there is no proof as to when such notice was received by the drawer, then the presumption of prima facie evidence as provided in BP 22 cannot arise, since there would simply be no way of reckoning the 5-day period. Okay, so what is the significance of that 5-day period? So here, it is yung prescription kasi is one of the defenses under BP 22. So ang prescriptive period is 4 years from the lapse of 5 banking days within which to make payment or arrangement for payment. So another defense on how to get away with a BP 22 case is forgery. So in your defense, you should put that hindi mo pirma yung nasa check So that is one of the defenses under BP 22. And for our last slide under BP 22 on how to get away with BP 22, in the case of Marie Gumen versus People, if the drawer or maker is an officer of the corporation, The notice of dishonor of the said corporation is not noticed to the employee or an officer who drew or issued the check for and it is behalf. The responsibility under BP 22 is personal to the accused. Hence, personal knowledge of notice of dishonor is necessary. Consequently, constructive notice to the corporation is enough to satisfy due process. So, in cases where the officer of the corporation is the signatory to the check, it must be the notice of dishonor must be sent personally to the officer of the corporation signing the check. So otherwise, he cannot be prosecuted or the case for BP 22 against the officer of the corporation will be dismissed. So that is the last part of my discussion under BP 22. Remember that there will only be two questions for RFBT on licensure examination for certified public accountants. So thank you for listening, and if you like this video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and click the notification bell if you want to receive notifications. So thank you for listening. If you have questions, you may drop your questions in the comment section of this video. So thank you for listening and see you on my next videos.